For millions, the voices of Guy Penrod and Wes Hampton didn't just fill rooms, they filled the empty places inside people that nothing else could reach. Then, without warning, without explanation, without even a goodbye, silence. No harmonies, no shared stages, just absence. And absence, when it belongs to something that once felt permanent, is one of the loudest sounds in the world. Whispers turned to rumors. Questions multiplied without answers. But nobody could see what was really happening beneath the surface. Both men were being broken, not by each other, by life itself. How do voices that sing about grace struggle to receive it? And what does it truly cost to let grace restore what silence buried? Stay with us. The dynasty and the distance. To understand why the silence felt so deafening, you have to understand what Guy Penrod and Wes Hampton built together. The Gaither Vocal Band isn't just another gospel group. Oh, it's an institution. Founded by Bill Gaither in 1980, the band has been home to some of the most legendary voices in Christian music history. But for a generation of fans, the definitive era was the mid-2000s, when Guy Penrod's iconic long hair and resonant baritone stood center stage, and Wes Hampton's smooth, soaring tenor completed the sound. These two voices weren't just complementary, they were magnetic. When they sang together, something shifted in the room. You could feel it. See, audiences didn't just listen, they experienced something transcendent. Penrod had joined the band in 1995, becoming the face of the group for over a decade. His stage presence was larger than life, his voice so powerful it could fill an arena without a microphone. Hampton came on board in 2005, stepping into the tenor role previously held by David Phelps. Together, they recorded albums like Give It Away and Love in Life that became instant classics. But what fans never saw was what happened off stage. These men prayed together before every performance. They studied scripture together in hotel rooms. They supported each other through the invisible struggles that touring life brings. The exhaustion, the time away from family, the pressure of being spiritual leaders to millions. Their bond wasn't professional. It was pastoral. It was brotherhood. And that's what made what came next so devastating. And the first sign that something was wrong came so quietly that almost nobody noticed. In January 2009, the announcement landed like a stone in still water. Guy Penrod was leaving the Gaither Vocal Band. The official statements were gracious, professional, the kind of language you use when you don't want to cause concern. Solo career, personal pursuits, new directions. All the phrases that veil the truth in politeness. But for fans who had watched Penrod lead worship for 14 years, who had memorized his every vocal inflection and stage mannerism, the absence felt immediate and personal. Bill Gaither pivoted gracefully, bringing back former members and releasing new albums that kept the machine running. But underneath the polished production and professional smiles, something had shifted permanently. Guy Penrod wasn't just leaving a job, he was walking away from the platform that had defined his life for over a decade. And he was doing it quietly, without fanfare, without farewell tours, without the kind of send-off that his legacy deserved. That silence, the absence of explanation, became its own kind of noise, and the questions it left behind would take years to answer. Echoes of struggle. While fans searched for answers on the outside, two very different storms were raging on the inside, and neither man was talking. Guy Penrod was fighting a war that nobody could see. So the departure from the Gaither Vocal Band wasn't about ambition or creative differences or any of the reasons artists usually leave successful groups. It was about survival. For years, Guy had been pouring everything he had into every single performance. that powerful baritone that shook stadiums? It came at a cost. The relentless touring schedule, the constant travel, and the pressure to deliver spiritual experiences night after night. It had accumulated into something his body could no longer absorb or ignore. During a rehearsal, it happened. He couldn't catch his breath. Mid-song, the voice that had led millions in worship simply faltered. His team rushed him to a doctor. The diagnosis was both a relief and a devastation. Vocal strain severe enough to threaten his career, combined with overwhelming physical and emotional exhaustion. The machine had run out of fuel. Guy made the hardest decision of his life. He canceled everything. He walked away from the stage, from the cameras, from the adoring crowds. He retreated into silence and rest. But here's what nobody knew at the time. In that silence, Guy wasn't just recovering his voice. He was confronting something far deeper. "I was singing louder than I was listening to God," he would later confess. The years of ministry had become performance. The worship had become work. And somewhere along the way, he had lost the connection that made the music matter in the first place. The stillness that was supposed to be temporary became sacred ground, a place where God could finally get a word in. Meanwhile, Wes Hampton was facing a completely different kind of darkness, one that came not from exhaustion, but from accusation. Years before, Wes had done what any faithful mentor would do. He offered private guidance to young Christian artists navigating the industry, words of encouragement, advice about staying true to their faith, the kind of conversation that happens between believers every single day. But someone saved those messages. Someone waited. And when the timing felt right, they shared them out of context with people already looking for a reason to judge. The backlash was swift and merciless. Critics accused Wes of compromising his beliefs, of blurring the lines between ministry and secular music, of failing the standards expected of someone in his position. None of it was true. The messages were innocent, the guidance was sound, the intentions were completely pure. But truth doesn't travel as fast as gossip. Wes found himself defending his character against accusations that felt like knives in the hands of people who had never once known his heart. And here is where his response becomes the lesson. He didn't fight back. He didn't issue angry statements or demand retractions or flood the internet with his defense. He went silent. "Sometimes silence is the only answer love can give," he said softly to those closest to him. He stepped back and leaned into prayer. He chose grace over combat. But grace, for all its breathtaking beauty, doesn't erase pain. And Wes carried that pain entirely alone. So here were two brothers in faith, both fighting battles they never asked for, both wounded in profoundly different ways, and neither of them reaching out to the other. Not because they were angry, not because there had been a betrayal, but because they were both too broken to know how. Pain has a way of isolating even the most connected people. When you're in the middle of your own storm, you convince yourself that everyone else is fine. You tell yourself you'll reach out when you're stronger, when you have something to offer instead of just more need. And the silence between them grew. Months passed, then longer, and the distance that was never meant to be permanent began to look, from the outside, like it might be. Behind the silence. And then, in a way that can only be described as divine intervention, everything changed. Neither man knew the other would be there. It was a private men's retreat in the Highlands, the kind of gathering that happens far away from cameras, far away from audiences, far away from the relentless pressure of performance and public expectation. Just men, just worship, just the kind of silence that strips everything unnecessary away and leaves only what is real. Guy came because he needed to be still in a place where no one expected anything from him. Wes came because he needed to be reminded that not everyone in the world was waiting to misread his intentions and use them against him. Both men arrived carrying wounds that hadn't yet finished healing, but neither arrived expecting what God had already quietly arranged. For 2 full days, they moved in separate circles inside the same building, completely unaware of each other's presence, eating at different tables, sitting in different corners of the same worship room, carrying their individual burdens in the same space without knowing that the one person who understood the weight was just across the room. And then came the second night of worship. The room was dim, a candlelight pressing back just enough darkness to feel intimate. Voices began rising together in the timeless hymn that has held believers through centuries of grief and uncertainty. Great is thy faithfulness. Guy was standing near the back, eyes closed, letting the music move through wounds that were still tender to the touch. And then he opened his eyes. Across the room, standing half in shadow, was Wes, tears streaming freely down his face, singing through the pain with everything he had remaining. In that moment, Guy didn't think. He didn't strategize or rehearse what he might say. He didn't calculate the risk or weigh the outcome. He just walked through the worshipers, across the room, until he was standing directly beside his brother. He placed a hand on Wes's shoulder, firm, steady. The way you reach for someone you should never have stopped reaching for. And with a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke 4 words that broke open years of silence like light through a sealed room. I miss my brother. Wes turned slowly. His eyes were red, his face wet, his voice unsteady with everything he had been holding alone for too long. But the words that came out were the only ones that had ever mattered. I never stopped being one. Here's what didn't happen next. No cameras captured the moment. No press releases announced the reconciliation. No reunion tour was planned. No carefully timed social media post dropped. No interview scheduled to walk the public through what had privately transpired. What happened in that room stayed in that room. 2 men of God stood together in worship and did something more powerful than any performance they had ever delivered to any audience anywhere. They forgave. Not each other. There was nothing between them that required that. They forgave themselves. They forgave the circumstances that had quietly pulled them apart, and they released the pain of years lost to separate wildernesses. Separate battles fought without the person who knew them best. And they let grace do what grace always does: restore what nothing else in the world can fix. In the weeks that followed, the conversations continued. Phone calls that stretched long into the night. Prayers that didn't need eloquence because both men were finally too honest to perform even before God. The slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding a brotherhood that had never actually shattered, just been buried under the compounding weight of struggles neither man had known how to share. They talked about Guy's health, the vocal recovery still quietly ongoing, the lessons that forced stillness had carved into him permanently. They talked about Wes's wounds, the cruelty of being misread by a community you had given everything to serve, the exhausting weight of being judged by people who never truly knew your heart. And somewhere in those conversations, both men arrived at the same profound realization. The silence between them had never been a wedge. It had been a womb, a space where God could do individual work in each of them so that when they returned to each other, they wouldn't just bring performance or professionalism, they would bring presence, real, hard-won, unbreakable presence. And that was finally something worth offering. Brotherhood restored today, both Guy Penrod and Wes Hampton have returned to ministry, but not in the way fans might have expected. There are no joint tours, no reunion albums, no carefully staged comeback specials. And maybe that's the most beautiful part of the story. Guy re-entered music on his own terms, releasing a deeply personal EP titled Quiet Strength. The title says everything. This isn't the powerhouse baritone of the Gaither years, pushing through every song with athletic intensity. This is a man who has learned that strength sometimes means stillness, that power sometimes means patience. He focuses more on family now, on the rhythms of normal life that the touring years never allowed. His music is quieter, but it carries more weight. Because now, when he sings, he's not performing, he's witnessing. Wes has returned to a different kind of ministry. He mentors young worship leaders, and the kind who might one day face the same accusations he faced. He offers support to those who feel overlooked or misunderstood by the church. He carries his wounds not as burdens, but as credentials, proof that grace is real because he needed it and received it. They don't often share the stage anymore, and that's okay, because true reconciliation doesn't require a public performance. The greatest healing happens behind the scenes, in rooms with no cameras, and between people who have learned that presence matters more than production. So what really happened between Guy Penrod and Wes Hampton? The answer is both simpler and more profound than the gossip mills ever imagined. Life happened. Life with all its strain and exhaustion. Life with all its misunderstandings and quiet accusations that never get the correction they deserve. Life with the kind of pressure that breaks people who seem, from the outside, completely unbreakable. But grace happened too, and restoration, and the kind of healing that only comes when two people stop trying to explain themselves and start choosing each other instead. They chose not to let distance define their story. They chose to honor each other even in absence, to protect what they had built even when they couldn't stand in the same room and say so. They chose to let God do the slow, invisible work that only silence could accomplish. The refinement, the stripping away, so the rebuilding from the inside out. And what emerged on the other side wasn't a lesser version of their brotherhood. It was a truer one, tested by fire, proven by stillness. The gospel music world loves harmony. We love the blend of voices, the perfect chords, the moments when everything locks in and heaven feels suddenly, impossibly close. But the harmony that matters most isn't the one captured on a record or performed under stage lights. It's the one that exists between hearts when there is nothing left to perform. It's the willingness to carry your brother's burden, even when you can't see him and he hasn't called. It's the choice to believe the best about someone, even when the silence around them screams the worst. It's the hard, daily understanding that sometimes the most faithful thing you can possibly do is step back, go quiet, and trust without evidence that God is working in the shadows, doing what no press release, so no apology tour, and no public reconciliation ever could. Guy and Wes didn't just survive their silence. They were shaped by it, hollowed out and rebuilt, returned to each other not as the polished, stage-ready versions the world had always seen, but as men. Real, tired, grateful, restored men who had each been to the bottom of themselves and found grace waiting there. That is the testimony, not the harmony, the healing. And that story will outlast every song they ever sang together. See, 2 million albums, decades of ministry. But the real legacy of Guy Penrod and Wes Hampton isn't the songs, It's the silence they survived. They bowed under pressure, but never bowed out of brotherhood. When the smoke cleared, they were still standing, changed, quieter, but completely whole. So here's what their story asks you directly. When your own silence comes, will you trust that grace is still working, even when you can't feel it moving? Wait, when the distance grows and the explanations run out, will you hold on anyway? And when you see your brother struggling across the room, broken, worn down, too tired to reach first, will you be the one who walks over? Because somebody has to. Let it be you.